There's a big debate happening in football right now, and it centres around Pep Guardiola and the current Brazil national team manager, Fernando Diniz. Now, Guardiola is famous for his brand of positional football, and Fernando Diniz has described his football as apositional. So what does all of this mean? Why is everyone talking about it? And do the ideas here go deeper than football itself? Well, in order to answer those questions, we need to talk a little bit about the tactics of position. So on the board in front of me, I've got a quote from Fernando Diniz talking about how his football is different to that of Guardiola. So as you can see, he says, people associate me with Guardiola's way of playing because I like my team to have the ball, but that's where the similarities end. He then goes on to describe Pep Guardiola's style of play by saying, his style of play is what people call a positional game. The players stick to a determined space and wait until the ball arrives there. Now, we all know what Pep Guardiola's football looks like. Here's a really nice example of that from the Champions League last year when they played against Real Madrid. And as you can see, Manchester City have a really clear idea of what the structure is that they're going to play in. You can see all of the players in these predetermined spaces, to use the phrase that Diniz used, and these players are positioned in these areas for very specific reasons. Now, we can divide the pitch into two here because in the front line, we can see that it's all about generating space. So we have two very wide players here. Here's Jack Grealish on the near side touchline, you can see, and then all the way across the other side, he has a teammate spreading the play across. So you can see that Real Madrid have really been pulled right across here. So they've generated space that they can attack. Here we have Erling Haaland attracting two centre-backs towards him. And again, this is creating more space for Manchester City to attack through. So this is all about having players in specific positions to impact the opposition structure, to make it easier for Manchester City to progress the ball and generate dangerous chances. Now, in the second half of the pitch, we still have the same ideas being used there, but in a very different way. So what we have is actually three players in the back line, two players playing as midfielders. One of these players has actually stepped up from the back line in order to create this much tighter group of players in the middle. Now again, the position of these players is important for two reasons. The first one is in possession. So what we've got here is two players pulling the Real Madrid players close towards them. So you can see we've got an aggregation of Real Madrid players in the centre of the pitch here. Now, having all of these players close together is going to make Manchester City's build-up easier, but what it also does then is it opens out the access to the wide area. So we can see if this centre-back here gets the ball, turns, he can now play the ball down the line into the winger here. So by squeezing the space this time, instead of spreading the space as in here, we're actually making it easier again to progress the ball by impacting the space of the opposition players. Now, the second idea here, of course, is defensive. So if Manchester City lose a ball in their build-up phase, because they've got so many players in the centre of the pitch, it's going to be very hard for Real Madrid to attack through the middle, which is where the goal is as well. So this has got a defensive element as well. So this is the basis of positional play. What you're doing is you're using your structure, the positions of your players, in order to impact the structure and position of the opposition team, and as a result, you're going to make it easier for yourself to move the ball down the field and generate chances. So how does Fernando Diniz differentiate his own approach to football from this positional play approach? Well, let's go back to our quote from him, and he says, the way I see football at the moment is almost apositional. The players are able to migrate, changing positions. In certain sectors of the pitch, we come together. What does this look like? Well, I've got a screenshot from Brazil's recent game against Peru. Brazil are playing this way down the field in this clip, and what you can see is that actually the Brazil players have all aggregated on the far side of the field here. I think there's about 8 Brazilian players on this side of the pitch and very few on the other side of the pitch. So this is the coming together that Fernando Diniz is talking about, but it's important to remember that this is still about ball progression, but ball progression in a very different way to the way Pep Guardiola is doing it, because it's not thinking about using position in order to move the ball down the field, but actually thinking about the relations between players, being able to actually pass the ball between themselves, get them close together, do these one-touch passes and move the ball in that way. And it's also important to remember that while Diniz's teams aren't going to be using position so much to move the ball down the field, that doesn't mean to say there's no structure whatsoever. So what you may see when you watch Diniz teams play is these series of staircases, or escadinhas as they're called in Portuguese, where the players get into rows, and the idea is then that they are able to get close together, they know where their teammates are, and as a result they can do those quick passes between one another in order to again move the ball down the field. So that's Fernando Diniz's apositional football. Rather than using position to move the ball down the field, what he's relying on is the individual talent of players and the relations between players in order to get that ball moving down the pitch. So on the face of it, what we have here is two football managers who think about the game in very different ways. But the question becomes, why is it that the debate often shifts into a register where Pep Guardiola starts to become blamed for all the ills of modern football? Well, one reason why that's the case is that so often this debate becomes oppositional. That is, Pep Guardiola is set against Fernando Diniz. And we can see that language already creeping in Diniz's quote. So let's go back to it, because he talks about Pep Guardiola and says, Guardiola's way of having the ball is almost the opposite of mine. And so subtly then, the debate is being framed that you're either on the side of Pep Guardiola or you're on the side of Fernando Diniz. Either you think about moving the ball down the pitch using positional principles like Pep Guardiola, or necessarily you must think about moving the ball down the pitch using apositional principles like Fernando Diniz. But is this even true? Because it does seem as though there is the possibility for coaches to exist somewhere between Guardiola and Diniz. For example, when Diniz is talking about his football, he just suggests that there's a possibility within apositional football for players to migrate or change positions. But there's plenty of positional coaches who will use interchange or rotation as a way of getting an upside as well. I'm thinking of coaches like Ange Postecoglou, Marcelo Bielsa, Erik ten Hag. All of those coaches are positional, but they're happy for their players to move from one position to another. But then there are some coaches who will use some positional ideas, but then use some more apositional ideas at different phases of the game. Xabi Alonso at Bayer Leverkusen will use positional ideas in deeper build-up, but when he wants to attack, he'll actually get a lot of his players moving together in order to be able to do some of that more apositional attacking. And so the reality is there's lots of different ways of thinking about football. Some coaches will use the ideas of position or aposition as fundamental factors behind the way that their teams play. Other coaches will use them as incidental factors. They'll borrow some ideas here, borrow some ideas there, and some coaches simply will not care. So why make the debate oppositional? Well, by making the debate Guardiola versus Diniz, it's much easier to shift it into a frame of reference where we're talking about us versus them. And by making it an us versus them argument, it's much easier to sneak in ideas about moral or aesthetic values into the discussion. And we can see that subtle sneaking happening in the quote from Diniz. So this is the section where he's talking about his own football, and he talks about it as being a freer way of playing the game. Now, freedom is obviously a moral quality, and it's not a word that we often use when we're talking about football, but for Fernando Diniz, it is super important, and that is because the modern positional approach that is embodied for him by Pep Guardiola is all about curtailing the freedom of players. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we've already talked about how Jack Grealish has to often sit out on the touchline for Manchester City in order to create space for his teammates to attack. Now, Jack Grealish probably didn't grow up dreaming of being a positional pawn in Pep Guardiola's Manchester City, but the reality is that a lot of the time his role in the team is about dragging other players away rather than doing things on the ball. It's likely that he grew up dreaming of actually doing things on the ball, dribbling, scoring goals, changing the lives of fans around the world. But that is not what is happening here, and for Fernando Diniz, that is a curtailment of some of the things that footballers really want to be doing. As an aside, it is worth saying that Fernando Diniz is using a very specific concept of freedom here. That is, freedom is the freedom from constraints. But there are some other philosophical accounts of freedom out there, and in fact some philosophers argue that constraints can actually make you freer in the long run. So Pep Guardiola's system can actually free up his players to play better than they would without those impositions. And we've all played in those five-a-side football games where there's absolutely no structure whatsoever, and I think we can all agree that those have made us worse players. Now, here's another quote from Diniz where he talks a little bit about that in more detail. He starts off saying the human dimension is more important than tactics. So the structural stuff that Pep Guardiola is doing is not as important as the actual individual feelings of the players that are involved. And as we can see, that word feeling appears later on in the quote, and he says, that's what inspires me, letting each player be the Pele or the Maradona they have inside of them. So what started out as a debate about how to play football has actually become a much bigger argument about what it means to be a footballer in the first place. And for Fernando Diniz, the way that Pep Guardiola gets his players playing is actually a curtailment of his freedom. And for Diniz, an underlying aspect of his apositional football is about allowing the players to celebrate their individual qualities. But it goes even further than this. So I've got a quote here from Jack Lang's recent article in The Athletic about Diniz, which is a fantastic article if you want to find out more about who this guy is. So Jack Lang writes that Diniz once described his style as a return to the past, adding, Brazil doesn't have to copy Europe, we have to create our best style here. So what started out as a debate about football has now become a question about what it means to be Brazilian. And so what we have here underlying this quote is a story about Brazilian football. There's this idea that in the past, the Brazilians had this jogo bonito, this beautiful game, which later was lost as they imposed European ideas, as managers came in and adopted those European European ideas. And this is all about taking Brazilian football and bringing it back to the way that they used to play this jogo bonito. So in this way, we've arrived at a point where Pep Guardiola's football becomes a cipher for a much bigger issue, and that is the slow denigration of Brazilian football, adopting European ideals, and now we have Fernando Diniz who's going to carry Brazil back to playing the beautiful game. But I think this framing is unhelpful for a number of different reasons. Not only have we suggested that there is no opposition between the tactics of Pep Guardiola and the tactics of Fernando Diniz, they're both just different tactical approaches in a much broader context of tactical ideas. But I also think this presents a really unhelpful context for the debate, because there's no manager on earth who's actually judged by the aesthetics of the way that they play football. Pep Guardiola has spent his whole career being judged on his ability to win games, so it's the effectiveness of his approach that's at question rather than the aesthetics. Although ironically, when he first burst onto the scene, his football was considered quite aesthetically beautiful. And in many respects, the reason why he's set up as the enemy of aesthetic football is because he's been so successful at winning, maybe the most successful manager at winning ever. So there's no other standard against which managers are judged by than their ability to win. Aesthetics is nice, and it's great that Fernando Diniz is here raising questions about the status quo in football, but now that he's operating at the highest level of the game, he's also going to be judged by his ability to win games. And if his Brazil can't win games, then he's going to find out pretty quickly how much Brazilian fans care about aesthetics over winning games of football. Now, we could have a debate about how winning has become even more important in this hyper-capitalist age of football, but the reality is that winning has always been important. In fact, ironically, this is the very reason why Brazilian football adopted those European ideals in the first place, because they felt as though their own beautiful game wasn't effective enough. So is Pep Guardiola really the worst thing to happen to football? Or is it actually the case that the worst thing to happen to football is that there's been no viable alternative found to the effectiveness of Pep Guardiola's football? Now, it would be lovely if Fernando Diniz was part of that vanguard of coaches who come up with this new approach. But if he is, he'll be being judged against his ability to win games rather than by playing beautiful football.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.